Guten Morgen, bonjour. It's a pleasure, as always, to see you. So many of you are so familiar, but it's been a long time because I've been, as you know, living in the desert for 4 years. And it's really a pleasure to see you all again, to be with you in this unbelievably magnificent place. And I think if I can persuade you to listen to me and look at me for 5% of the time with that view, I will have achieved success. The assignment for this talk, as you can see, was to look at the relationship between the future of Europe and the global forces of change that we see as most active, starting with those that are economic. And something fascinating, before I dive into the content, that came out of this analysis and looking at this question, which, by the way, when I first joined the firm 5 or 6 years ago, we looked at a very similar question, and that is how similar the strategic challenges and the strategic future of Europe, how analogous it is to the future of our firm as a global consulting firm. And if you think about it, the European Union is a partnership enterprise. It is about pooled sovereignty, and it is about alignment and integration with autonomy in ways that are so similar to what we're doing as a business. So when I think about A.T. Kearney as a global firm and I think about Europe, the opportunities are incredibly related, and so are the challenges. So before we get started, a multiple choice question, if I may. And this is the question that we asked 5 years ago, and it'll be interesting to see the answer now. It's multiple choice. There'll be 3 options. I'll ask you to raise your hand. In 10 years' time, do you think the European Union, not, by the way, for the moment, let's set aside the UK, that the European Union will have its same membership? That's option A. Option A, the European Union will have its same membership. Option B, it will be partially changed, but still fundamentally there. And option C, the European Union will be essentially no longer there. It'll be, of course, a community of friendly nations, but not a European Union. Option A, in 10 years' time, the same membership. Please raise your hand. Okay. Option B, some change, but, wow. Okay, and option C, that the formal institution will no longer exist. A few contrarians. Cool. Okay, great. Well, so the Middle East is famous for geopolitical drama, geopolitical instability, political change, conflict, war, sectarianism, and so we have a very busy and active time there. And at the NTI, we do almost more consulting work than we do think tank work, which could be a problem. But the work spans, scenario planning work for the world's largest privately held company, doing the scenario work for the national strategies for the UAE's 4th Industrial Revolution strategy, its national food security strategy, work in cybersecurity, homeland security. So we're doing a lot of work that gives us not just a really clear lens on what's happening in the region from a consulting and for clients standpoint, but of course, always the global context is so important. And it is certainly true that the fault lines in the region are in a pretty fragile state. Being American, I can tell you that we are in the midst of really an unprecedented political crisis. And when I returned to the question of Europe, I was happy to see that we are not alone. So it really is quite incredible, the extent, and you all know it so well, firsthand and so intimately. Hopefully it's valuable to hear someone from the desert having taken a look at it with fresh eyes from a distance. But it is remarkable to see, country by country and case by case, how much political disruption is underway. As you know, 432 to 202 was a historic margin in the vote last night about Theresa May's proposal, and its rejection has never been so dramatic. So it is a very fragile time in this, unlike for our firm, where we are in very solid times, for the European Union, it is a very fragile time. And it would be fragile and challenging even in settled, stable circumstances. But we are very much not in settled and stable circumstances, of course. I'm not going to go through all of these. You're familiar with them. But the bottom line is that the world, and by the way, you've heard, I think in talks I've had with you before, in sessions we've done together, this has been true to varying degrees for 6, 7, 10 years. But never to the extent that it is true now do we have multiple very strong disruptions occurring in so many different dimensions at once. And really useful things. So We have the National Transformation Institute, and we're just finishing a very large paper on what does transformation mean at the societal level, and what are the levers, that's our commercial angle, what are the levers by which transformations can be accelerated. And in doing that work, it's fun to brush off some of the readings that we don't always get a chance to do. And in that context, I don't know how many of you are familiar or have read, and if you haven't, I urge you to, Why Nations Fail. But there's actually a concept that goes well before this book called critical juncture. And a critical juncture is a period in history, every 20, 25, sometimes every 50 years only do they occur, that is characterized by tremendous strategic fluidity, which I know everybody in this room is seeing every day, uncertainty about the future, which is certainly unprecedented right now, and also institutional flux, where institutions themselves are in a period of very rapid and uncertain change. What's crucial about these periods, and this is not some invention, this is the study of 30 years of scholarship, is that agency and choice play a disproportionately significant role in these periods. By the way, the opposite of a critical juncture is a settled period, when things aren't changing very much. And therefore, you're more on guided pathways of development. The range of choices available to our clients, to a large institution, is narrower. Whereas in a critical juncture, and I'm certain that we're in a critical juncture right now, every choice has longer-term consequences, there are more choices available, and the outcome of those choices are more important. And the other big sort of empirically derived finding of a critical juncture is that when they're done, they tend to create a lot of divergence. So it's never been the case in history that when the world emerges from a critical juncture, all boats have been lifted or sunk evenly. It's never occurred. There's a big period of change. And so they are exceptional periods of choice, opportunity, and consequence. For us in our business, there could not be a better time to sell consulting work than a critical juncture. Because in a critical juncture, what you need more than anything else is adaptive capacity. And what are we but intelligent, adaptive capacity brought in to help our clients meet the challenges, exploit the opportunities they see. And I'll tell you, it couldn't be richer. I don't think it's a coincidence that demand for our work is so strong right now. Okay, so very, very quickly, I'm going to start by talking, before getting into the sort of hardcore, if you will, disruptors, I'm going to start with the global economic outlook. We have just yesterday released our latest Global Economic Outlook. You will all be receiving that, of course, the document itself, as well as the PowerPoint, so you can brief it yourselves. Let me very, very quickly walk you through it so I can get to some of the more disruptive factors. I think economics is generally, and economic forecasts are usually the baseline. And as a committed, passionate scenario planner, of course, I believe that uncertainty is always so crucial, but you've got to have your baseline. That's what the economic outlook is, of course. And our way of organizing everything I'm about to tell you is that the global economy is on thin ice. So if you look at that growth is still expanding, especially in a few places, but for a whole host of reasons is likely to decelerate this year. We're already seeing it in 2019 and beyond. This is a 5-year look. And as you can see, getting down from its current heights of about 3.1 down to 2.6, which is actually quite a significant change. Why is it changing? 4 reasons I'll walk you through quickly. Debt, demographics, productivity changes, which has been true for a while, and then, of course, the islandization of the global economy, the trade dynamics that we're seeing. So, debt. It is just 1 decade over the global financial crisis, and although we've made a lot of structural reforms that bode very well for the global economy, there's a dark side, which I'll get to in a minute, but the first bullet point of the dark side is the debt overhang, which is truly stunning, 244% of global GDP, and it's not evenly distributed, and it would matter less if we weren't on the verge or in the midst of exiting quantitative easing. Of course, and we all know what that's going to do to interest rates. And so in the context of that debt burden, which is unevenly distributed and not denominated in the same currencies everywhere, it will, as it has always done, cause some near-term instability. But it is also more broadly a constraint on growth and investment, except in my country, where Donald Trump will invest regardless of the debt position, of course. Next, we have the labor force challenge. And there's a lot of good data here on this gap lower participation in the workforce, and yet a higher working age share of the population, and the gap in skills is becoming crucial, very much driven by technology. We had a chance to go meet with Eric Brynjolfsson, who was a huge influence on my thinking at MIT, who's written The Second Machine Age and the platform leader in platform thinking and AI, who basically says that it is occurring, the displacement of jobs by technology, but as you probably all know and are seeing, it's not happening in some broad, widespread way. It's happening in very narrow and specific domains, and it's also generating new jobs. But it is changing the total volume of required labor in a number of areas, and it's increasing the demand for specialized labor where there isn't some. But in Europe, the demographic reality that we've looked at in the past really is striking. And sometimes I think a data point is more powerful than a chart. In the 1950s, there were 7 workers for every retiree in the advanced economies. And in the European Union, assuming that those who answered A or B are correct, and my 2 friends down here see, I guess this would still hold, the numbers are the numbers, the ratio will be 1.3 to 1. Now imagine a ratio of 1.3 supporting every retired person. That is a game changer. Okay, weak productivity growth is the other piece. Last year, Economic Outlook focused on that, so I'll be brief, but there's less investment, partially because of debt. There's less infrastructure, and technology and its productivity gains are diminishing. Productivity growth, we should say, it's still growing. It's just not growing as quickly, which is another reason for the deceleration. And then finally, something we're all very familiar with is the islandization of the global economy. And this has many reasons. It is remarkable to see how many islandizing, how the extent of economic nationalism and protectionism actions and how consistent, by the way, how unadvertised they are. And China, for example, a country that I did my honors thesis on at the University of Chicago, a country that I admire and really love, and is a brilliant country. But one thing that they have done, and I say this maybe to save some grace in the eyes of my current president, but it's true that China pushes for openness of the global economy, but hasn't opened their own economy as much. They are one example among many countries who have both sides of the equation in operation. One is advertised and one is not. Part of why islandization is occurring is not just political populism, which we're going to get to in a minute, which we've touched on already, but it's also the fact that the institutions of global economic governance are under huge pressure and change. And as you know, there are several of them that after World War II were formed and that were responsible for what we called globalization. That was a prior version of globalization, which is actually now fundamentally changed. But those included, first and foremost, the World Trade Organization, which for 10 years has been unable to negotiate a deal. Its representation is considered incorrect. It has been very weak in enforcing, and as a result, diminished its legitimacy with many players. And now we have a US administration determined to change it and threatening to break it in the process. The International Monetary Fund, where I have a lot of very close friends, an institution I respect tremendously, but it too is under tremendous pressure and it's being questioned in terms of its representation and in terms of its effectiveness, and very much, and this is what I hear from clients, not on the analytical side, very much in terms of saying, does the IMF model of economic development really apply so purely across all contexts or not? I think it still largely does, but the politics of implementing it have become extremely difficult. The World Bank, similarly. It's the World Bank, and I think it's not coincidental that the brilliant American who is running it just suddenly stepped down. It is facing a true crisis of legitimacy and power as well, primarily because other institutions are rising to fill the gap. And this is true, by the way, on the geopolitical level at the UN, and we should just baldly acknowledge the reality of it. The reality of it is that the power structure that existed when we formed these institutions and the United Nations is no longer the power structure that we have today. Now, on purely numerical terms, the prior distribution of power in those institutions was never just. Look at the population of China. But we could justify it based, I guess, silently on geopolitical power. Well, that's no longer the case. And so the unwillingness of the United States and Europe and others to seed and genuinely reform the representative structure of those global institutions is, in my opinion, I hate to say it, quite properly causing others to say, you know what, if you're not going to adjust, we're going to build our own. And they are building their own. And in building this new generation of alternative institutions, the power, the legitimacy, the reach of these institutions is by definition diminished. By the way, I hope now I've proved to you that this critical juncture, by the way, I've got to admit, I love the phrase critical juncture. I think it's cool. The fact is, it's also empirically true. And it's all about institutional flux. And if I haven't proved to you institutional flux after these 6 minutes, I never will. Okay, so what else is happening? This further fragmentation, of course, to the extent that it proceeds, it's going to do a lot of things to the environment in which our clients make money or don't make money. First of all, it's going to slow productivity growth. Globalization, because of comparative advantage, as we all know from Economics 101, has been a primary driver of productivity growth. It's also creating much greater downside risk in a crisis. And in fact, there are a few of these points. Here's one that I would really like you to not leave this room without grasping. We emerged from the global financial crisis and have made a lot of reforms, including in Europe. So in many ways, we're much better prepared. But at the same time, in terms of our fiscal resources, you saw the debt numbers, and in terms of our monetary policy instruments, even though we're beginning to step back from them, it is just not clear that we have the firepower to respond to another global financial crisis as effectively as we did to the last one. And crucial to that, ironically, is not about how much money we have to release into quantitative easing, it's about political unity. Because surprisingly, what was effective last time was our ability to really coordinate multilaterally. We had a moment of global unity. Do any of us think that if the same thing were to happen now, we could expect that same degree of global unity? I'm really, unfortunately, not sure. So for our clients, it's going to require huge business model innovation to operate in a much less globalized, much more multi-localized world. And of course, there will be lower growth in general and higher degrees of uncertainty. So then here's the aggregate picture, okay? Take a look and find yourselves on this map, as we say. As you can see, the story of India is incredibly powerful, and the India growth outlook, despite ongoing political challenges, continues to be exceptionally strong. That's what's driving the South Asia numbers. Needless to say, East Asia, of course, led by China, the great global juggernaut of technocratic, merit-based governance, not democratic governance, trying to do the right thing over and over again and play its hand as well as it can. So even though for China, that's slow growth, of course, that's huge. The U.S. growth outlook, as you've also heard, is very strong, percentage-wise less, but because of the scale of the economy, that's a huge, huge number. And you've got, finally, Africa. And we are, of course, for Europe, hugely important. Also for the Middle East, the growth outlook over these next 5 years for Africa is actually quite strong, although in all of those places almost decelerated relative to the expectations of a year and a half ago. In Europe and Eurasia, it is basically a clear case of slowing economic momentum after 5 good years and a lot of good things that are happening. But Brexit, uncertainty, geopolitical tensions, we'll get into it, of course, is causing a slowing of the outlook. And if you look at the numbers by these largest countries, it's consistent with that. Now, keep in mind, the head of the IMF always jokes that of one thing you can be certain, it's that our forecasts will be wrong. But this gives you a sense of where the most talented economists in the world see the trajectory for Europe going forward and where they see the divergence among the biggest economies going forward. This is just the outlook for next year. And you see China at 6.2%, India 7.4%, the US 2.5%, which of course is still very strong in a whole host of ways. But then when you start looking across a wider range of countries, you start to see a lot more divergence. So as this unfolds for our clients, it's going to really require a much more disciplined and creative approach to finding markets that are open to integration and exchange. It's going to require supply chain redesign, and a lot of you are already working on this, and we've even spoken about it, of course, but in a multi-local world, how supply chains are redesigned is going to be crucial to their effectiveness, where resilience is a risk. We'll get into this in a minute. And then, of course, exchange rate volatility and also compliance, local levels of compliance. And here's one where the analysis confirms it, but works for clients and current for this very large company and their Brazil operations. The importance of local compliance is becoming ever more important. Okay, so that's the baseline view. And if that's the baseline view, then what might disrupt it? 4 big things. The geopolitical transition we're in, technological competition, We talk so much about technological innovation, which is obviously crucial, but we're at a point now where we're seeing something different, which is this intense competition around technology between countries, environmental dislocation, and finally, socio-political deconstruction. There's really nothing else to call it. You can bust out some of the old college philosophy terms without BSing in that context. So geopolitically, it is reshaping the global environment, and the issue is structural. So, as you know, geopolitics pertains to primarily the relationships between nation states. Nation states themselves are ever more sharing power with the private sector, with civil sector, and a whole host of other actors, so that their ability to be coherent, unified actors is being diminished systematically. In the meantime, the structural environment in which they operate and the rules of the game by which that system, Henry Kissinger calls the international order, operates, are in a state of deep transition. First and foremost, because of the rise of China and the dynamics that I just described. Never in human history has in this case, a returning great power, has a returning great power entered a settled international system entirely peacefully. We all hope and pray, certainly I do, that it'll happen this time. It's just worth acknowledging it has never happened before. Secondly, the disruptive power of Russia. When I started doing scenario planning 17 years ago, and we no longer had to include Russia. Can you imagine? We could do a driver set for a set of scenarios. We didn't need to account for Russia. We really didn't. Russia was like, will it be a serious basket case or a partial basket case? Well, Russia has real challenges, but I can tell you this. There is not a scenario for any client on earth that I could do now where we wouldn't have to account for Russia as a driver because of Vladimir Putin's success in creating power, some would argue, out of nothing or out of not much. Finally, we've got competition for resources, which is becoming extremely intense, and not just energy, as we know. And then this geo-economic innovation. What does that refer to? Nation states are becoming incredibly creative in how to use financial, economic, commercial instruments to achieve geopolitical ends. That is a destabilizing force. Anytime you have a new tool set, a new set of weapons in the martial interaction, then the rules of the game are less clear, and it can be destabilizing. And so we mentioned the political institutions. I think we've already hit this point quite clearly. They are not adapting to the new power structure, and so then that overarching governance structure is weaker. So the structure of the system, the components of the system, and the overarching unity, all of those are weaker or in transition. What does that mean? That means we'll see more fluid alliances. We're going to see greater proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. We're going to see more forced migration because of conflict. We're going to see disruption of supply chains, and a whole host of strategic shocks become more likely. What does that mean for Europe? First of all, unfortunately, in Europe, it means there's a much greater risk of conflict, both on Eurasia, on the Eurasian continent, where many would say, and I would tend to agree, curious if you disagree, that there's a war happening right now in Ukraine. And Europe is also, by the way, not just as nation states, but also our clients are going to face some very stark corporate diplomatic choices navigating between China and the US to the extent that they remain in the kind of tension that they're in now. Because of those things, Europe will be subject to mass migration risk. North Africa remains fragile. The Middle East remains fragile. And of course, in the immediate periphery of Europe, there is fragility. So the risk of migration happening again in large waves is very high. And finally, what does that mean? This is where that multi-local perspective for our clients and for government agencies becomes crucial. Thinking about the world in a different way, which technology, of course, is making ever more possible. That brings me to technological competition. And I'd like to say to my friends in the back, I'm going to hit my time mark, I promise you. So technological competition, this is an evolved set of thoughts from work that I did with several of the people in this room on geotechnological competition. It is about the fact that innovation occurs in clusters that have a geographic location that create national security and create competitive advantage. And right now, that is focused very much, of course, on artificial intelligence, which has the capacity to change everything. But I believe, and Eric Brynjolfsson, who's a true expert in the field, I'm certainly not, confirms is going to be primarily disruptive in certain verticals. But where it's disruptive in a vertical, it will be deeply disruptive. The experimentation and adoption is spreading very quickly across a whole range of industries. I'm sure you're already seeing it. I'm so thrilled at our acquisition because our ability to speak this language, understand and apply it. And I've already been told, by the way, to stand down and not already try to hit them up for some foresight help, Alex. So I will not, but I would love to when the chance arises. The application of these tools to strategic foresight is actually extremely powerful and kind of expensive. So robots and advanced automated systems, of course, are inextricably tied to artificial intelligence. That's part of how they operate and part of why they're becoming so powerful. I'm sure you know that, but basically, robots are now in the mode where they can learn from the learnings of all robots through machine learning. That's a big part of why their functionality is increasing so rapidly. But their pervasive economic and national security implications is part of why, not the only reason, cryptography is another, that AI and this competition is so crucial, especially between the US and China. And by the way, I'm really lately conscious of narrative and the power of narrative. And the last thing I want to do is set up for some narrative of this US-China. The US and China are unbelievably interdependent, and they have tremendous complementarities. And with wise leadership, that will be their focus. At the same time, they are competing intensely on several fronts, nowhere more so than in technology and artificial intelligence. One, trying to use that power of markets, education, and that critical mass, the attractor effect. The other on the power of scale, national resources, and the ability to take focused, disciplined, long-term decisions overnight. The private sector titans are also engaged. And of course, in the case of China, because of state capitalism, that is a unified strategy, if you will. Whereas in the US, it's not quite as unified, although I guess Larry Ellison might disagree, given where he's recently, the boards that he's recently left. But the strategies are quite different, one driven by state choices, one driven by market choices. From the perspective of European business, this competition and these different strategies have huge consequences. Whom can you partner with? With whom can you share innovation enterprises? One of the key parameters of this negotiation on the trade war, of course, is about intellectual property protection and the requirements of companies operating in this amazing market called China. Those rules are changed, and I think that they will change, but that's the kind of decision being aware in detail. So I think we're going to, as a firm, for projects involving choices like this, our partnerships with legal entities so that we understand the precise legal dimensions of choices around innovation are going to become increasingly crucial. Finally, and I'll be quick on these, big project that we've done for national cybersecurity strategy, absolutely fascinating. Cyber threats, as we all know and have seen each year. By the way, so if you think, I've heard this before, I keep hearing this. Well, you keep hearing it and you will keep hearing it because it keeps rising in profile, especially from the perspective of CEOs as among the most significant risks in the global operating environment. The cost of cybercrime explains it, if you can imagine, expected to reach $3 trillion by 2020. Truly remarkable. And for this project, we did interviews with a whole host of CTOs from large corporations who say that the estimates of the cost of cybercrime far, far undershoot the mark because of the extent to which they miss opportunity costs from downtime. And in fact, and I think actually they've published their studies. So if Lars is here, he knows, but Maersk is one of those who's been most open about what the cyber attacks to which they were subject cost them. And it's truly remarkable. And this is just to show you, it's not just about attacking government assets. It is political, economic, social, infrastructure domains. All of them aren't just, I think 6 years ago, if I gave a briefing on cybersecurity, I mentioned these as hypothetical targets. They are no longer hypothetical targets. This is a part, look at the font size we used on this slide. We could have created 6 slides like this, but we wanted to give you a sense. And by the way, that's something Bob Willen and I share. We love small fonts. Anyway, but not everybody does. So what does that mean for Europe? And what does it mean for our clients in Europe? First of all, and I'm a big believer in not neglecting to state the obvious if it's important. And in this case, the preeminence of cybersecurity to everything that we do can't be overstated. It's almost, if I can put an extreme point on it just for effect, it's almost hard to imagine a project where cybersecurity will not be some type of design consideration for a strategy or a capability. It's crucial. Next, AI frontier innovation capacity. For Europe, in a world where China and the United States, both with government resources and private sector resources, are doubling down so aggressively in AI, machine learning, quantum technology, supercomputing, Europe has to be a player in that game independently. It can't only participate in innovation networks globally, it needs to have, and of course it's building, it has everything it needs to do it, but it's crucial for Europe, in my opinion, as a citizen of the world, to be competitive in that domain. Next, data alliances. So for countries who want to give their key private sector enterprises access to growing markets where data-driven business models are going to be increasingly crucial, we're facing a world where there will not be one internet. The internet will truly be divided along regional and national lines in ways we haven't seen before. For that reason, it's going to be crucial for businesses, for countries to have new forms of data alliances to make sure that access is there. And finally, technology governance leadership. Given what's happening and the nature of the competition between China and the US, and this is an indictment of my country, neither of those countries has demonstrated a passionate commitment to protecting and centering technology on the interest of human beings. And you should all take so much pride because Europe has. So the world desperately needs Europe to be a player at this table and to exert its leadership in protecting privacy, in creating a technology competition environment that favors human beings, not just markets, because if left to the others, it's a Machiavellian fight to the end. And the loser in that equation will be individual citizens and consumers. Okay, from that to a much happier topic, climate change. Climate change, we've recently discovered, is going to be solved. And in fact, tomorrow morning, you'll see the announcement that it's no longer a problem. So I can move on to the next slide. Okay, just seeing if you guys were awake. Yeah, unfortunately not. Boy, I got the deadpan. Everybody was that hopeful. Maybe you're optimistic. There is a clear correlation between rising man-made emissions and increasing global temperatures. And there's a clear correlation between increasing global temperatures and severe weather events. Period. Halas. The only 3% of scientists who disagree are on the payroll of those who make money on the prior system. Period. There's no debating it. MIT, Harvard, everywhere. The Chinese agree in spades and have proven it with some of the best science in the world. So that's a reality. Changes in the climate and extreme weather events, of course, are imposing huge economic costs. If you look at the financial impact of these major natural disasters, we took out the earthquakes, Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, floods, Hurricane Ike, these costs are massive. And the consequences in terms of the required preparedness steps are also crucial. Global sea level rises. So here you see, and by the way, you can scan it. There's a 10-page executive summary of the recent IPCC report, which I really, really recommend. It's quite brilliant. But basically, what you see here are the bands of their trajectories. And if we were to today have effective global governance that made amazingly draconian and aggressive steps to balance it out, we might stay at 1.5 degrees of change, which would mean we'd only lose 70% of coral reefs, for example. But sea level rise, no matter what, is going to happen. And so much economic activity. So many population centers are centered in coastal areas, including in Spain, in Italy, in the Netherlands, that's a crucial factor. And again, even if aggressive action is taken, it's going to happen. So for our clients, in a way similar to cybersecurity, sort of everything that we do as consultants, in my opinion, we should at least keep this angle in mind and see how it might matter. For any long-term strategy, this issue will be important. For Europe, it's remarkable. In Europe, for one thing, so because of the critical juncture the world is in, and it's not coincidental that that critical juncture is most pervasively present in Europe, it's creating an opportunity for a political reorientation. I can remember when I was a kid hearing about the Green parties. Well, in this climate environment, in this climate, the political reorientation in favor of Green parties is going to be very strong. In addition, for Europe, given technology edge in this area and given its commitment from governance standpoint, infrastructure, there's going to be a huge global environmental market opportunity. We're seeing many of those, including in energy. It puts a huge premium on resilience and financial readiness given the cost and given how many European cities are in coastal zones that are exposed. And once again, and if you're noticing a theme here, I give you my sacred word of honor. I didn't set out in this presentation to sort of, how could I find something positive to say about Europe? Not at all. In every one of these domains, we're facing a global challenge where the most legitimate voice is Europe. And so maybe it's not a coincidence that there are other forces in the world attacking Europe at exactly that moment. Because Europe has a voice on this, it has leadership on this. It could benefit in terms of climate leadership and being maybe a little bit more Machiavellian. Not Machiavellian in the sense of self-interest, but in terms of understanding the power of the process. But we need Europe to lead on this issue. Finally, socio-political disruption. You know how complex the sources of populism are. This is the $20 million driver, as we know. And it's a driver on its own because of inequality, because of how globalization proceeded and the ways in which globalization was not previously inclusive, but now it is being attacked and used. Those underlying demographics have been now, because of what technology enables, are being used by bad actors to manipulate and sow disruption. You've probably seen that we now have evidence that the Russians, for example, were, and it's funny, for Americans it's painful, they were systematically targeting themes that with black Americans would resonate and using those to sow dissension. So they were literally fabricating stories for the specific purpose of either making black people in America not want to vote or making them feel that they were being oppressed in ways far beyond what they already are, making it 10 times worse. That's one example. Brexit, Estonia, Spain, Italy. The use of technology to disrupt through disinformation campaigns in very sophisticated ways and cause social disrupt is having huge effects, and it's affecting trust. And governments and businesses, of course, are beginning to fight back. Media companies are doing things. We're seeing steps, and that's crucial, and that's got to happen. But the effect on trust is already crucial. Just quickly, and I'm almost very nearly done. For this paper on transformation, it pulled us into this whole study of social capital, civic capital, trust. Everybody thinks about Fukuyama's book on the future of history, but few know about his book called Trust. He's one of many scholars. The empirical evidence that social capital or trust, by the way, and the best definition, and a lot of research we found, is civic capital, which is both interpersonal trust, which is most manifested by the ability to trust a stranger and engage in economic interaction with a stranger, and political trust of institutions is incredibly highly correlated with economic growth. Firm level performance, it's customers' trust of a company, of our clients, and government institution trust by citizens in terms of their ability to get things done, and as a whole, economic growth are extremely correlated. Ken Arrow saw this a long time ago. It can plausibly be argued that most of the economic backwardness in the world can be explained by the lack of mutual confidence. That's not an emotional sentiment, that's an empirical finding. And so for Europe, what does that mean? It means we're going to keep seeing this diffusion of political power, but also opportunity. We're going to see the rising importance of strategic narratives as one of the key instruments for our clients and for governments in navigating a contested and complex information environment. I don't know if you know, strategic narratives, and there's now narrative analytics. It's not, hey, let's go in the back room and invent a story. It is, let's exactly study the components of where we need to go, the causal steps needed to get there, the role that Alex plays, you play, I play, our constituents play. Let's create a credible, compelling narrative. Before we release it, let's go test it analytically to see its patterns of resonance and resistance. Let's tailor it accordingly. This is a real thing, and it's going to become increasingly crucial. Next generation social infrastructure are the institutions of trust, and then, of course, strategic investment by our clients in trust and resilience. So, in conclusion, by the way, this is the best image NASA has of Europe. So, in conclusion, without a speck of romance, I want to say to you that the world desperately needs Europe to succeed. Really, it's incredibly important because it's a model of peaceful pooled sovereignty, progress centered on human values. And so The overarching finding of my analysis for this speech was that what Europe most needs right now in this moment of peril and dissolution, fragmentation and challenge is to double down on its very Europeanness. It is those core European values, human respect, legitimacy, trust, climate leadership, all of the things I've gone through. Those are the things that can not only save Europe, but that can so benefit the world. So thank you very much. Appreciate your attention. We have time for Q&A, or you can go get coffee if you prefer. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you. Oh, one question, please.
I have two questions. One is, could we send part of this or a summary of this to our friends and clients that are going to Davos?
Yes.
I think it's very good, and it gives you a lot of ideas, and it could be I think they might be very interested now to read this before going to Davos. The second thing is, where would you invest our bonus this year?
By country or sector?
Both. I mean, where?
Your cousin's unknown AI startup that has both Chinese and Silicon Valley funding. And if he exists, let me know, because everything I've got will go there. Yeah, I say that because, of course, all the AI investments available to us are already priced up. I have no idea where to put investments these days. It's such a difficult environment. But I think that's why we're seeing private equity and these target investments be so powerful. Sir. Hey.
If Europe is so important for the world,
Yep.
as you say in your conclusion, how close are we to the leaders in Europe and the European Commission helping them, shaping them?
A.T. Carney? I believe we're closer than I thought, because a friend of mine this morning said we're doing some work there and maybe we can collaborate. So I don't know, but I hope that we are, because there should be a great deal of opportunity. You know, one of the things that they're struggling with is something that we are experts in, which is the balance of decentralized authority and central control. And so I think that we could be of tremendous help to them in thinking through decisions rights, duplicative regulation, a whole host of things that might make things, using the fourth IR to work better. Yes, please.
I noticed in one of the charts showing the economic growth outlook that you guys predict Europe will grow 2% and the US 1.8%. From what I know, the long-term demographic projection for the US is much more favorable to growth than Europe. So why do you guys think Europe might actually beat the US in growth?
Well, I'm going to check. I think for next year, US growth looks better than European growth. In the longer term, and I will go back and look at those numbers, but because of Donald Trump, our primary source of demographic advantage was that evil open border with Mexico. You know, for 10 years now, we're doing geostrategy, and when you calibrate America's advantages, one of the biggest one is the one you mentioned, demographic advantage. That's that open border. So whether that's been IMF calibrated in to decline those estimates, I'm not sure, but I'll get you a detailed answer to that. Please. Thank you so much, everybody. See you soon.